Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Colin Wright, who is an evolutionary biologist and author and editor of Reality's Last Stand, which is a Substack that focuses on gender and sex issues. And he's been in this battle trying to stand up for reality, specifically sex-based reality, or the reality of male and female as like a human reality for many years now, and fighting against the gender ideologues and gender ideology. Most recently, he published a meme or a cartoon about the trolley problem and what is at risk when trans activism gets its way over reality, and was promptly, or shortly thereafter, publishing this meme on Twitter, suspended from Twitter for hateful conduct. He is now back on Twitter, and while he was in the stocks, we caught up and had a conversation about his work, and he's been on my channel before. Great guy. So let's get on with the show. Here is Colin Wright. You got the touch. You got the power.
There you are.
There you are, Mr. Speakeasy. You have a floozy around the corner?
off camera.
Yeah, no.
Can't see her. I should pour myself a drink for this one.
You
now
want?
that I'm in...
Go ahead, do it. Why don't you make us a cocktail? Take us through the steps.
The cocktail stuff. I'm more of a whiskey neat person.
Okay.
I'll just go with whatever's in the decanter.
Ooh. Do you know what it is?
I think it's been a while since I've
Can't
put it in
it?
there. I think it's Johnny Walker Black.
Oh. Ooh.
I don't usually put like really nice stuff in there because I want to use the decanter more, so I kind of put decent but not crazy expensive stuff in there.
So, speaking of decanting, have you recanted your post?
I knew there was going to be a little flourish, herbal flourish. No, I have not recanted my sins.
Yeah, no, sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
It's funny because I posted the same thing 2 weeks before that. I mean, it was basically the same joke. But
which one? What would you put up there?
Mine was it was the picture of the trolley problem, and
did you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
did I rip you off completely? I didn't even know.
It's an easy joke to make, which is silly that they're cracking down on you, because I was like, okay, so we could save one possibly trans child and confuse the hell out of 999.
Oh, okay. I think I remember seeing that. Maybe it was in the back of my head when I thought of this one.
This is how the memes flow, man. We just like bang it around. It's a big. Do you ever work in an ad firm? We're all just spitballing. You know?
It's different enough. Copywriting it.
Oh, okay. Did you copyright it? You better.
I haven't.
You should make a mug.
I probably should on these things now. You know, I don't make cartoons very often, but when I do, they tend to make an impact. It's ridiculous.
Huh.
Oh, wow. It's crazy, though. Yeah.
Hate speech.
Well, hateful conduct, and then because it was apparently directed or something at vulnerable groups or based on gender identity. But, you know, I was actually really careful to make it when, you know, the person that's pulling the switch, you know, at first I had it say, like, you know, this is a trans activist, but I didn't want to be like, well, the activist is trans. I didn't want to be like, it's a person. So it's actually labeled trans activism, which is this, and it's only a specific strain that like I'm really concerned, because I know, and as you know, plenty of trans people who are also against sort of the modern radical virulent strain. So I was actually being quite careful to make it so it was only about criticizing ideas, a certain brand of activism. And I mean, in the pathway straight ahead on the cartoon is reasonable accommodations. It's suggesting that there's plenty of compassionate people that it would be reasonable, would reasonably accept some some accommodations for them, which would actually help them more. And this pathway that they're taking, I could also have put people with gender dysphoria, they could have been tied to the track as well, because they're the ones that are like the sacrificial lambs on this stuff too, that they're not getting the help that they actually need for people who legitimately have this condition. So it doesn't help them to sort of have their therapy tied up with these reality denying ideologies. So it was trying to be a compassionate cartoon for everyone, saying like it didn't have to be this way. We could all join hands and just sing Kumbaya at some point.
And it was in and of itself, as I responded later to your ban, that was Twitter's trolley problem. We can allow for open discourse, or we can allow for this woke ideology.
I have a new version that, once I'm back on, I'll probably post it. It's it's the trolley problem, but straight ahead on the track is actual real pedophiles. And then it has, the trolley represents Twitter bans. And then on the side track is like me, James Lindsay, Gays Against Groomers, and Dr. Rollergator, who are the ones getting banned off Twitter when they could just actually address the real problems in the world.
The G word, you brought it out.
It's not something I say on Twitter, really. Like, I'm not the okay groomer person on there. But I'm really sympathetic to the Gays Against Groomers cause, because I think they're rightfully pissed off. I mean, the gay movement, they achieved so much social acceptance based on real grievances, and those are sort of being sacrificed by this adoption of these radical ideologies that have nothing to do with homosexuality whatsoever. But they're, this radical ideology is using all this symbology, the rainbow flags, which they've bastardized that. The same organizations that were fighting for this stuff, they've just hijacked these, but they're using the same symbols in order to say, like, we're the same thing. This is just, an extension of this same process, when it's just couldn't be more different. There's not an ideology involved with being gay, with saying that, hey, just understand that my love for this person of the same sex is just as strong as yours for the opposite sex, and maybe we should allow people to love who they love. That's not an ideology. That's just a human experience that people can relate to and be compassionate towards. So
it might not be an ideology, but it is it's culture specific. The West is the first major civilization in the modern time to back away from criminalizing and slandering.
Yeah, the acceptance is the cultural thing, but like the prevalence of it, the fact that it's there, I think people are just innately attracted to who they're attracted to. So you can either accept that as a real phenomenon in nature, or you can not.
Well, I mean, genital preference, that's kind of transphobic, isn't it? I mean,
So I've heard.
Yeah. Sorry to bring that up. That's a low blow. You can't bust the balls of that cohort without wandering into
Sure, there's some
dark territory.
wordage there for low blow genital preferences, something.
Yeah, there is something there. So you started. You ventured out onto your own. You left your parents' basement or first floor in Sacramento.
I was on my own before that, living in Pennsylvania as a postdoctoral scholar.
Okay, yeah, but you were still you're in the mama. You're sucking the teat of mama academe. Anyway, I'm joking. But you moved out to Nashville and you ventured out on your own professionally too, and started up Reality's Last Stand. Is that an anime reference or a Wild West reference? What are you referencing there?
As far as I know, I came up with that. At least, I mean, if someone else came up with the name before, at least I'm not aware of it. I had a tweet maybe 2 years ago where I used that phrase the first time. And I think the tweet was something like, people often ask me why I care so much about biological sex. and I don't remember the tweet verbatim, but it was like, if society can be convinced that sex isn't real en masse, this low hanging fruit of what people should be able to verify, then we become hostages to chaos because, you can basically deny anything if you can deny the reality of the existence of males and females as real biological categories. And so that tweet went really viral, and people really liked the reality's last stand sort of phrase that I used, and I thought that was sort of a perfect way to conceptualize like why I care so much about this whole sex and gender debate. So I thought it was a good name for the Substack. In the future, 10 years, I might have to change it because who knows how this debate's going to be unfolding. I already have plans if I have to pick. So
Contingencies, huh?
yeah, because I do have, all my eggs in the Substack basket right now. That's all I do is I'm a Substacker. I don't know if that's officially coined phrase
well, no,
yet.
you're an editor, though. I mean, you produce content, but you also host other people's content.
So I guess, I call myself like the founding editor of it. So it's more of a, I guess, like just a publication now that talks about this topic, and that was a good move for me to start publishing other people's content, because publishing 2 articles a week on there, plus I do a big weekly recap that sort of synthesizes all like the important news for the previous week and with some analysis and stuff like that. And it takes a long time to get those done. So the articles that I publish from other people, they're good at bringing in new like free subscribers because they tend to go viral in a big way. And then once I do like the weekly recaps and the reading lists, those are for subscribers, like paying subscribers only. So I end up netting a few of those free subscribers during that. So it's kind of a good system. It's consistently growing. So I'm pretty optimistic about where it could go.
So the weekly recap, is that breakdowns of cultural issues, like weekend cringe kind of stuff, or do you go through like the latest articles? Like today or yesterday or early this morning, Popular Science produced an article, it came out with an article about avocados and how they show us that human beings are more than male and female. There's even a partially Y chromosome that some women have or something like that.
Yeah,
Did you?
I saw that. It was actually the article, because I looked at the link, and the article is actually from 2019. They just decided to like repost it, and I somehow had not seen that before. So that'll go in the next one. Yeah,
Okay.
the recaps. It's really the main. Like, what did I have in this most recent one? It's like the main news stories. If you want to, if you need to read the sort of cliff notes with some analysis about like, to keep current on the whole sex and gender debate. So this one, it talks about sort of the Boston Children's Hospital fallout. It talks about the AAP and sort of how they're sort of walking things back and gaslighting people on what gender affirmation care really is. It goes into that 10-year-old transgender model that is taken to the catwalk, and everyone thinks it's bold and brave.
Stunning.
The new article, and I don't know if you saw the new article in Science magazine about how astrophysics helped me embrace my non-binary gender identity in all its complexity. So just things like that, like this insane things. I start with like sort of the insane things of, how did our society get here? Then there's a section, it's called the sanity section, because they would complain saying that they just were depressed as hell every time they would finish reading my recaps. And so I needed to have some
erotic cartoons at the
some
end.
hope that is in there. So I have like a sanity. Sometimes it's hard to find some sanity, but I make sure to put some in there. And sometimes there's either like a whiskey spirit review, or sometimes I've been putting these moments of zen where it's just like really great monologues of people that are going hard against sort of gender stuff. So it's sort of a grab bag of a bunch of interesting. So I try to keep it interesting, and I think it's fun. It's fun to write, and I think people enjoy it.
So when did you start delving into and surfacing for public consumption the gender woo? Was that at the end of 2018 or 2019?
When did I first start talking about this stuff?
Yeah.
That was November of 2018. That was
4 years
That
ago.
was when, Quillette published the New Evolution Deniers piece that I did. Strangely enough, though, that really had nothing to do with gender, really. It was all about, because at that point, I was just like the scientist who was saying people are wrong on the internet about what biological sex is. So it really didn't even go into sports. It didn't go into gender ideology. It had nothing to do about gender affirming care or childhood transition, any of that stuff. And that came much later. That came after I was saying, like, where is this ideology coming from that's denying the reality of biological sex? And so once I like peeked under the hood for a little bit, that's when it got real. It was no longer just people who were just, they're wrong about biology. If I just show them why they're wrong, then we'll just all, it'll be fine. Because the pushback I was getting to my scientific critiques were not scientific rebuttals. They were, you're a sexist, bigot, homophobe, all that stuff. It's like, this is odd. And so it's coming from this other place, the queer theory ideology type of stuff. And so then it's really been sort of a spiral for me getting into that stuff.
Yeah.
And just seeing like it affects so much more than just like the biology of sex. It's touches on so many important aspects of society, as you're well aware.
Yeah, that's why I keep on finding more fresh content in this. And the Popular Science tweeted that avocado article out. And then the next tweet under it was like, if you are a transphobe, please block us. Thank you. Right? So it's like, in debate. Trans women are women. End of debate. End of debate. Which is, I guess that's kind of popular, but is that science?
It's the same argument over and over again about if we can show examples in nature where sex is fluid and you can change sex, even if it's a freaking avocado, then that somehow gives us like this important insight into the nature of sex in humans. And it's just a complete non sequitur. It's just, yeah, we could acknowledge that avocados and asparagus and clownfish have different systems than we do, and snails, they can be true hermaphrodites. They do that little, it's kind of like the bait and switch. They're like, look at all this diversity in nature, and then they just start talking about humans without skipping a beat. And then the implication is that like these things can tell us about ourselves. They might get at some fundamental aspects of what sex is. I mean, I think the examples they show, they don't undermine the two sexes. They just show various ways that sex can manifest in different species. So it doesn't do what they're planning on doing or what they're trying to do. It just, they have to do a little twist at the end there and hope people don't notice.
Well, and the DSD, differences of sexual development or intersex, which I'm putting out there because that's what people could probably recognize, they're used as a token. They're just trampled over. Oh, you're not a real woman. You have an extra chromosome. You're not a real man, right? So it completely dehumanizes the identity of those people who are very marginalized. They have a medical condition that can be pretty drastic. It could be pretty mild too.
Yeah. And important to say that, intersex people, that this is not an identity. This is just literally a condition that you have. That, I mean, most people, it's something they have to deal with and live with. And the idea that you can just point to intersex people as a way to say that sex is a spectrum, as a way to then leapfrog into the idea that sex is arbitrary, to then leapfrog into the idea that we should just let anyone identify into whatever category that they want to, because if it's just sort of a social construct, if we don't know where that line is, then no line is justified. And and then they're using intersex people in order to justify people who aren't intersex, who are just a trans woman who's just a normal biological male, using them to say that they can identify as the complete opposite. But trans people aren't intersex unless they actually happen to be. But yeah, I mean, it's just, again, once you're used to hearing these arguments, they know that these aren't even like convincing arguments. They're just. It's just like this gish gallop of crazy things they can just sort of throw into the space, into the intellectual space, to make it so people like me have to just keep popping balloons and keep, so many plates spinning at the same time that we can't get anything done.
But so I brought up your first foray, and you said that that wasn't the first time that you actually got into the gender side of it. But once you did get into the gender side of it, it's been a few years. Are they coming up with anything new, or are they just recycling the same kind of pattern over and over and over again? Is there anything novel? Is there anything interesting in it after you get past the absurdity?
No, I haven't seen anything new. I mean, I've seen the sort of language change actually a little over time,
Okay.
and how they're presenting things, and how they're starting to include, there's an acronym, I can't remember, but it's like trans, and it's TGN or something, like trans and gender nonconforming. Like they've just sort of added gender nonconforming to the trans population, and this is something that we've been saying so long, that they're just transing gender nonconforming people, and now they've just like explicitly put it in there. Now it's like trans and gender nonconforming people, and you go to these websites where they're like telling about who's eligible for surgeries, and they're like trans, non-binary, and gender nonconforming people. It's like, when did that get added? Like, that's sort of a new thing in the last, I feel like the last year, that we're seeing more, where they're just sort of coming out right and saying what we've all been saying, which they've been insisting that they're not saying. So that's been interesting.
I have seen a couple of years ago, I think at least, evidence that NB surgery is a thing, or like androgynous transformation to make a woman less womanly or a man less manly, and kind of get this aesthetic, which really does get to the aesthetic, which I can appreciate. I can appreciate the androgynous. This. When I was in college, there was those androgynous girls, the kind of boyish, kind of tomboyish. Those always kind of like attractive kind of women, but you knew that that was kind of a period of time that the woman stuff would kick in, and wanting to preserve that immortal youth is kind of the heart of androgyny, because everybody, an 11-year-old is perfectly androgynous, and that aesthetic itself is, I can see the allure of that and wanting to be that. It's one thing to do that, which is a whole other ethical question, to modify your body for an aesthetic purpose, but it's just a part of our culture. It's another thing to then enforce everybody accepting your identity or denying the reality underpinning the identity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. We've seen, I think the non-binary thing really gives up like the whole ideology that's underpinning everything. Because one thing to have, the Buck Angels and the Blair Whites of the world, who are just, they have dysphoria, they're trying to present as the opposite sex. And it's a whole other thing to be non-binary and not identify with any sex whatsoever. Like, that's not something that humans are. And then when you actually get into the weeds about what they mean when they say they're non-binary, they say, well, they reject the gender binary. They don't fall into that. Well, like, well, what is that binary? Because they're not claiming that they're intersex. They're claiming that they're non-binary. And they're not claiming, so that's not the sex binary that they're rejecting. They're rejecting the gender binary, which is like these socially expected roles and expectations of society. So masculinity and femininity, broadly speaking. And this is what even like websites like Planned Parenthood, this is how they define the gender binary. This is how like the American Psychiatric Association defines it too, when they talk about non-binary people and the gender binary. This is just, it's a pure ideological construct, and it's just out in the open that we're medicalizing just literally gender non-conforming kids. I mean, I was looking at I'll pull it up. It's a piece I'm writing now too, where I kind of go through a lot of the way that like these major organizations are defining what being transgender is now, and how it's really just changed. Let's see here, like here's how the American Psychological Association defines being transgender. They say transgender is an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or, very important, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex which they were assigned at birth. And that's just gender nonconformity. That's just like, I'm not a masculine man or feminine girl. I mean, it's
And is that somehow something that needs to be treated? I mean, that's the implication, right? You need to treat
yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've mentioned before how this wouldn't be really an issue if it was just like a subculture among some youth, and they're just playing with like new words to describe themselves, and they grow out of it when they're older. It's like goths and the emos and the scene kids or whatever. There was some like degree of body modification going on there with piercings and gauging your ears and that stuff. But there was never like a medicalized component. But this new sort of wave of the whole trans kids thing, the non-binary movement is, it really shows that, again, it wouldn't be an issue if it didn't have this big medical component that swings into motion the moment someone says they reject the gender binary. That's just, kids are normal to reject regressive stereotypes. I mean, to a large degree, I'm not coming across as like Randy Macho Man Savage here to you, at least I don't think
I've seen your Instagram though, so you say that, but I mean, and then I've seen your girlfriend too, so because they're kind of Barbie Ken a little bit going on there.
I mean, respect. I would be very happy to spend a good portion of my day just like bottle feeding kittens all day. Like that's something that I would love to do. That's not a stereotypically masculine thing to do. So,
well, I was a preschool teacher. That was like a 99 percentile. There's not a lot of men in that industry. It was pretty educational to be enmeshed in the matriarchy. As long as I have, I learned a lot. And with the kids too, I learned a lot about gender. I learned a lot about sex, and I saw that all those stereotypes, what we call stereotypes, are emergent most of the time. And there's some feminine boys and masculine girls, and you can kind of tell like, oh, this person might grow up to be gay. You might grow up to be gay, but they're not gay now. They're just who they are. But I was just always amazed when I thought about the feminist critique of gender as these impositions on children that they're molded. But I would see a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old girl and boy completely plug into the world differently. Girls tend to be much more social, much more verbal, and boys tend to be much more rowdy, rough and tumble. But they both need both. They both need to experience both.
Yeah, this is where I actually get into trouble with a certain strain of radical feminists too, because
you get in trouble with radical feminists.
I mean, some of them. Because there is a strain of those people
who, wonderful women. A lot of them.
I actually like most of them.
Yeah, me too.
And even the ones I disagree with, I also like as well. But there is a really unhealthy amount of social construction that they also have too, with sex differences in behavior and things like that. Like there is a lot of people who are pushing back against the trans stuff. Against gender ideology, who will say that I shouldn't be talking about innate sex differences between males and females and their behavior because they still think it's all socially constructed. And I'm just like, well, you were like the gateway drug that led to where we are now with people who are like denying sex completely, because it used to just be like the blank slaters, and now it's, well, they're still sort of that, but like the blank slaters gave rise to these like blank morphology people.
It's not just a slate. It's like reality is completely projected. Like they're all about the projection. And I think that has to do with the will. I think there's a theological component or a psychological, philosophical component that centers like, I am the master of reality. I get to decide what my body does. And that does come straight from the assumption that it's all socially constructed. And I've heard Fourth Wave Now, Brianna, Denise, she has several names, but she wrote about that too, and she got in trouble with the same cohort of her fellow radical feminists because, and she said that they assume that gender stops here, like biology stops here, and there's all this other stuff that goes on in the head, and that's what I'm interested in on the next level. Have you investigated like behavioral patterns and discovered or articulated like the patterns that we call masculine and feminine and their relationship with Evo Bio or Evo Psych?
I'm getting into some of that now for a piece I'm writing, and it's actually really interesting. I've been talking to Marco Del Guidis or Del Guidice. I don't know how to say his last name. He's Italian. And he's probably the world expert. He'd actually be a really good guest for you to have on human sex differences in behavior, personality and behavior specifically. And he's done really great work on sort of the universal sex differences and measuring people's differences both on a trait by trait basis. And then he's really known for using this sort of multivariate approach where, because you get a lot of people that would say, like, oh, men are only 10% more aggressive than women, and men are 5% more on this and 3% more on this. And they say, like, well, these aren't really big differences. And his main thing is like, well, no, these small differences, they're all correlated with being males. And so if you actually like sum up these differences in a multivariate way, you can actually make an extremely predictive model where if you have someone fill out like an extensive survey about their personality traits, you can predict, in the high 90 percentages what the sex of that person is, more than if you were to measure anyone's individual trait. It's sort of like a good analogy to use would be like the faces of males and females, where if you say, how different are male and female faces? Well, people can really identify a male and a female face in the high 90% is just at a glance. But if you really want to break it down, like, well, what's the difference between a man's face and a woman's face? Well, it's, the nose is 10% this way, the eyes are 10% that way, the jaw's 5% more this way. But all those add up into like these sort of emergent differences where at a glance we can just be like, bingo, this is a male and a female face with high probability. So he's got interesting work. But then there's this whole other research that is dealing with sort of these gender stereotypes, because not all these sex differences really register in our brains as being like the same as these collections of things that we consider to be like gendered behavior. So there's this research on like gender diagnosticity, and it incorporates some aspect of like the things and people aspect of what people like. There's a lot of it, a lot of some of the most robust differences are like parental reports of their child's gender nonconforming behavior when they're kids, self-reports of their gender nonconformity, types of toys they like to play with. And it's actually really interesting because most of the sex differences and personality traits we see are more variable in males. There's like this greater male variability hypothesis that tends to hold up across many different traits. But when you talk about like a very specific, like narrow band of behaviors that we consider to be like gendered stereotypes, it's actually girls who exhibit more variation in gender norms than boys do. Some of this is like, it could be like the social norms that we attribute. Like we're more quick to say that a male is gender nonconforming if they violate one of these typically masculine behaviors that we associate with being boys, whereas girls have to violate more before we would say that they're really super gender nonconforming. So there's like a much wider breadth of traits that girls can have, and we'd say that, well, they're gender nonconforming. Boys tend to be more bullied into a narrower band of acceptable behaviors. And what's really interesting, so we have like, it's actually part of the article I'm writing is, we expand the definition of what being transgender means to being gender nonconforming. And so this would explain like a huge explosion in the number of kids who think they're trans.
Especially women.
And then we should expect there to be more girls who are exhibiting this, because girls tend to be more gender nonconforming based on this narrow set of sort of gender diagnostic behaviors. So this wouldn't even require, I think the social contagion is an aspect of this and stuff, but I think you can just look at some pretty robust research of just, changing definition and also the variation of behavioral traits in gender norms between males and females. And that really explains to me the enormous rise and the sex ratio flip we have in...
What is it, 4,000% increase of females?
Yeah. So it's a piece. I'm hoping it'll make a splash, but we'll see.
So,
I'm working with Marco because the wording is really difficult with the gender diagnosticity. I just don't want to.
Yeah, and it's all in Italian too. So
it's a tough piece to write.
So. Are you saying that men have, there's male variability in certain directions, and then there's female variability in other directions. Because I know, just sexuality speaking, females tend to be more fluid with what they find attractive, and males tend to get turned on by very specific things.
Yeah, there's that. There's sort of a higher variation in like toy preferences among girls. More girls when they're young tend to say that they wish they were a boy. Just their parents report them saying that. Than boys. Very few boys say that they wish they were a girl. Now this could be cultural to some degree, depending. And there's a cultural aspect that you can't really divorce from the whole situation. So it could be that males are actually more variable in lots of behaviors, but there's just like boys have less leeway before we were going to call them gender nonconforming than girls. So it's a fascinating literature, and I've really just been trying to pin it down to like a few behaviors, but they're kind of elusive to pin down in like a really rigorous way. Like, what are the exact traits? Because what's considered masculine or feminine, it kind of varies, and so you have to really use a few different diagnostic type of analyses to narrow it down. And then the whole social aspect of its kind of cultural aspect there was another sort of complex wrench in the whole thing.
We can give social constructionism or constructivism its due and say that there is a large influence that culture has on the shaping and the honing of people's behavior and the channeling them towards different things. And I think it would be understandable to be quicker to judge boys because we know that boys just get more intense into things. Boys, once they get on a track, they get really intense. And so we try to channel them in ways that are predictable, which is kind of good for society down the road because we can predict how a male behaves. Predictable males are much easier to get along with on a societal level because men tend to be pretty intense with how they end up acting out. Different ways.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Are you, I guess that's not really your wheelhouse to think sociologically speaking, but you're always you're in that no matter what. You're talking about gender, you're talking about culture. And I'm wondering, do you find yourself having to always doubt or always back away from kind of describing that level of discourse? Or do you find yourself gravitating towards kind of a firmer understanding of gender as a social contract or as a social conduct?
I think there's several different useful ways that people talk about gender. There are some that I think are crazy. Like, I don't think the way most people talk about gender identity is just sort of like what they really mean is it's their own inner awareness of the degree to which they're conforming to, that they innately conform to masculine and feminine stereotypes. To me, that's just like an awareness of your gender conformity. Like, if you put a scale of masculine and feminine and ask me to draw a dot where I think I am, it'd be on the masculine side, but it's not going to be like all the way over. And that's kind of, I think, what people mean when they are talking about gender identity. And the people who draw the dot closer to the middle probably would consider themselves non-binary. In the sciences, we would sometimes talk about like gendered behavior, even in like non-human animals. And that usually just means sort of the sex differences in behavior that we observe, like these we call like just gendered behavior. It's really just average sex differences in behavior. So that's useful. But I do think sort of the rad femme conception of gender as a social construct, whereas like the social roles and expectations that we place on individuals based on the sex we perceive them to be, I think that's really interesting and useful. And I think there's probably some valid research that can go into there and why we ascribe sort of these values onto people to the degree to which they're adhering to these norms. Because I think this describes like a lot of transphobia to some degree. Like when I say, like when a trans woman is experiencing bigotry by somebody, it's usually not because people perceive them as, oh, you're a trans person. It's really because society perceives them as like a really gender non-conforming male Like, what's more gender nonconforming than a guy putting on a dress and wearing lipstick and all that stuff? Like, it's the same thing that makes, effeminate men, gay men get discriminated against because they're gender nonconforming in ways that people can recognize. And the literature does show that being a feminine man, that is like the most highly predictive thing if you're going to get bullied in school. Like, that is just across the board. And it's not even the same for girls. The girls do get bullied if they're masculine, but they don't get bullied by guys. And guys don't bully feminine girls. Guys bully feminine boys, and girls also less to less degree bully feminine boys more, but less than guys. So I think those social constructs that we talk about of like these masculine roles and things like that, and the violations of them, I think that's really powerful to talk about those types of things. And those are the conversations we're not having, though, given that gender is now being talked about as this like this identity, like a soul type of thing, and based on stereotypes. It's not useful. I don't think that analysis is helpful at all. And in me doing my research on like all the gender diagnosticity, there's almost no paper after 2010 that is legible anymore, because the ideology, the lens that this is being viewed in shifts completely to the gender woo-woo stuff that we're dealing now. Before, it was just an acknowledgement of sort of these sex stereotypical behaviors. Now it's all gender identity and stuff, and it's almost completely useless. So all the studies before 2010, or that's where the gold is for me to like explain what's going on, because it just drops off a cliff.
Interesting.
2010.
Okay, interesting.
It's been really, really interesting looking at the shift that you see in the literature about how they talk about gender. Yeah.
I wonder if there's got to be a way to analyze that and then to kind of pinpoint how that happened. It probably came from the humanities, probably in the women's studies that then turned to gender studies, and then also postmodern analysis kind of came together and found the weakest point into STEM. To get into STEM was probably gender. So I wonder if that's like the most, not corrupt, but useless, non-scientific aspect of STEM at this point.
Yeah. There's also a lot of like gender workbooks you can look through. Like I got a couple of these here.
Yeah,
like
it's like really they're gender workouts, like, are there like different like exercises you can do to flex your gender?
Good. I don't know if you want to bring this in the gym, but this is anti-bias curriculum. Tools for empowering young children.
Oh,
I don't have it bookmarked
is that
on the
like
page
72?
Right now.
What day was that printed?
It's old. It's like from the 80s.
Yeah.
And it's super based. 89. Like you'll read the section on like gender, and they'll talk about how like being a boy or girl has to do with your sex, and we need to like they call it like sexist gender identity is saying that it's rooted in stereotypes, and they're really good at just like distinguishing between you're a boy because you're a male, and but also embracing gender nonconformity type of thing. And then I was looking because this same author, what's her name, Louise Derman Sparks, she has an updated version of like from last year, and I was like, I want to see the same book of what they're talking about now. It's completely different. It's all the woke gender stuff now. And I was like, what happened to you? Like you were made so much sense in this old book. And I just wonder if it's just like, does she really believe it? Or does she realize that like she can't publish this book anymore unless she like toes this line? Because I just can't imagine making that much sense is in there. I mean, it's shockingly breathtaking. It's refreshing as hell to read that stuff. And the new stuff is just terrible. It's just stereotypes, the exact thing that she rejected in this book as being regressive and sexist and all that stuff. It's fascinating.
Yeah, one of my unexplored ideas, but before transphobia, there was homophobia, and homophobia was a political tool it was one aspect of gay acceptance, and it was relied on a little bit, but there was a lot more work with just normalizing that the homosexual isn't some San Francisco person who's just like sleeping around. It's your brother, it's your neighbor. These are normal people. There's a normalization of that. There was just something that bothered bother me about homophobia as a bully tactic to get me to, just agree to a list of demands about marriage and reconform my idea of what I grew up thinking different terms were. But also on the other side of it, while you brought up feminine boys get bullied more, one has to wonder if homophobia is a emergent property of masculine group behavior. What is it there for? Like we can decrease it, right? We can say that it's not healthy for anybody involved. It's not a good thing, but it's still there. And if we can't even ask the question because that label homophobia becomes like it's a bad thing, so we can't even look under the hood. Why is that there? Why do men police other men's masculine and feminine behaviors?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but I would say that we're a sexually dimorphic species. That means that there is male-male competition for mates. Fewer males sire more children than there's a reproductive skew in males that's not there for females to a similar degree. And so I think there's just more competition among males to compete for reproductive access. So you can get there by shaming others around you and bullying others and making yourself, more dominant in retrospect if you can shame all these others and police the behavior of all the other males around you to sort of build yourself up. I think a lot of it can probably be because of that. I mean, it's just exiling the feminine men from your pool. It's just a good bullying tactic, I guess. It's not good, but I think it can be largely explained by this just male competition. That it exists in humans. It's not as pervasive as like in gorillas, for instance, where there's so much more sexual dimorphism. And then if you get into lemurs, where there's not really any sexual dimorphism apart from the genitals, there's really no policing going on there. They make their pair bonds forever, and there's very similar reproductive skew.
Could you highlight that point? Are you saying that the more sexual dimorphism, the more competition, typically speaking, and the less?
Yeah. You get sexual dimorphism by increased male-male competition. Like the species that you see where the males are so much bigger than the females, that's because the males are battling each other, tooth and claw for access to mating with a larger pool of females. And because the more dominant males end up reproducing with more and more of their genes go on to the next generation, and those genes are by and large the more dominant, larger males. I mean, you see this in like elephant seals is a pretty extreme example where, one big dominant elephant seal will be mating with essentially like all the females on the entire beach. That's why you see them just battling it out, and you also see the dimorphism that male elephant seals are just enormously like disproportionate to the females. And as the species, I mean, you can basically just draw a line through it for primates. Gorillas are at one extreme of sexual dimorphism and how territorial they are, and the male gorilla has, their group of females that they're all mating with. To a lesser extent, you have chimpanzees. There's still some dimorphism. Humans are dimorphic, less so than gorillas, and then you get to different species like lemurs and things like that, and they're almost identical size. I think the males are just a little bit bigger, but not much. Okay. And you can plot like the behavioral differences on that same graph of dimorphism. It's highly predictable, not even just in primates, but across mammals generally, and even other species too. So it's a really, really predictive trait when you see sexual dimorphism. You can almost always say like, oh, there's intrasexual competition that is creating this reproductive skew.
One wonders on an evolutionary time span if the gender nonconformity becomes the rule, if it would shape human beings into be less and less and less dimorphic and more androgynous. One just wonders if you could hit the button and see what happens. And how long would it take? 10,000, 10 billion? 100, 200,000?
Probably a long, probably talking hundreds of thousands, if not more, years. Yeah. I mean, there would have to be like decided selection pressure on that. And I don't think, individual tastes might differ, but I don't think like masculine guys are going to go out of style anytime soon. Yeah.
Slightly off topic, but because it might not be, I just wonder about your thoughts on the selection pressures of social media. Maybe you can speak a little bit about your generation or the Tinder generation, if you've had any thought about the selection pressures or the sexual marketplace and how it's informing human sexuality, if there's a feedback loop, if you've looked into that.
Yeah. I haven't looked into it too much. I mean, I've read some people's articles about it that I find interesting, and you can talk about. I don't really specifically know how social media like Twitter is affecting selection pressures and things like that, but I think in terms of like dating apps and stuff, I think that is, as a species, is probably not doing much because it's very, I guess, more of a Western thing to have these certain apps that are involving you selecting mates. But the data from like Tinder, for instance, I mean, it's just what every evolutionary psychologist would have predicted. You have a very narrow set of males who are getting the vast majority of the likes from women. Men tend to be much more egalitarian with who they're swiping on. It's much more evenly spread out. So you have basically like 80% of the women who are competing for the top 20% of guys with that reproductive skew. And so Tinder's not kind to most men out there. And when that becomes like the most dominant way that people are meeting people, it's really unfortunate for a lot of guys out there who have a lot to give in many ways, but who maybe just on a just a glance and swipe basis aren't ticking the main boxes immediately. So I think the move away from meeting people at friend groups in bars and that type of stuff, yeah, I mean it is definitely creating probably some sort of selection pressure. I don't know if it's going to be enough to really change the trajectory in any long-term source. I mean, we have so much inertia from history that I don't, you're not going to change the entire sort of reproductive makeup of humans in a couple of generations. So, but it's definitely contributing, I think, to a lot of, the whole like incel movement too. I think that can be described by a lot of this move to online dating type platforms and things like that. So it's definitely interesting. Yeah.
And somebody just posted on Twitter that their friend was taking them through, showing them lesbian Tinder, and it was mostly males. Like, it's really interesting. It's got to be evolutionary, right? Like, once you open the gate, of course men are going to try to exploit that.
Yeah.
market.
I mean, there's all kinds of ways people have described that. I mean, there are some species where the male will imitate females in order to get close to them to sneak reproductive access to them. I mean, they literally call them sneaky fuckers. Is what I think John Maynard Smith described them.
Do males ever identify as avocado toast to get into the wine mom market? I think that would be.
Well, avocados do break down the binary, as we know. So
they do. Yeah.
It'd be, yeah, I think you can. I mean, you can take lessons from nature. We see like the whole like sneaky effer thing, and that's really common in fish, and I think in some lizard species. And it's not that we can't learn anything about humans from these types of systems, because I think to some degree, like these dynamics do exist in humans, but it's just kind of but those are more behavioral patterns and reproductive strategies among males and females. It's not like undermining what males and females are at a fundamental level. So yeah, having a really good, taking a step back and surveying the sexual behavior of many species could really be enlightening to then just like look at humans as just another species that's not really unique, and just using the same metrics of sexual dimorphism and stuff to make predictions. And we're really not different. We don't break the norm like almost at all when you just take a pure anthropological look at humans. We're just like a large ape in many ways.
Yeah. Well, it's been embedded in our language forever, and it's not necessarily as accurate as like a David Attenborough film or something like that. But we call a man a lion or a pig or a rat, right? We can kind of see that there's different behavior patterns that we've animalized. We haven't gendered. We've animalized certain behaviors. I think that human beings. What do you think about that? That human beings have such a wide breadth of variation in our behavior, probably more than most any other animal. Is there any other animal that comes close to the variation of our personalities? We even had to create the concept of an identity or personality to speak to the variations.
That's really interesting. I mean, my PhD was studying animal personalities, so both individual and collective personalities of ants, bees, and wasps, and that type of thing. Social spiders as well. It's actually really unfortunate. There's not a lot of crosstalk between like the non-human animal personality literature, the stuff that I did, and like the human personality stuff. And it's mainly because like you can't give animals like surveys and really go underneath the hood and
get their Engram score.
Yeah, so whenever you try to like score animal personalities, it really has to be just like these unmistakable things that you can record when you're not knowing anything about the content of their brain. Like
so energy level, aggression.
How aggressive are you?
Yeah.
Like, oh, you really bit the hell out of that prodder, so you're gonna get a 5. Oh, you bit it only half the time, we probably get a 2. How social are you? How well they explore new environments. There's, put a novel object in the room, measure their degree of neophobia, how bold they are, their propensity to take risks in novel situations. Like these are the things that you score for like animal personalities. I mean, I guess you could probably do them for people to some degree, but it would be really hard to just like interpret them in like a one-to-one way with the same type of things you're doing in certain animals, just because there's a whole like cultural layer going on to it, and
a lot of software.
People, it's tough, but I mean, it would be interesting. I don't know how you would do those experiments in humans in like an ethical way. So I don't know if humans are actually more varied in their behavior. I mean, they might be. I'm not sure actually, because you'd be shocked about how, I mean, almost any species that you look at for personality differences, from spiders to ants to leaf hoppers, I mean, it exists. You find it everywhere, and sometimes the personality differences are really strong. We don't know the nuances of their behavior from the perspective of a leaf hopper, so it's hard to know how they're feeling on the inside. So, it's hard to say.
In the case of dogs, we've imprinted personalities through selection. We've increased selection pressure to manifest different personality traits. Intelligence, people say, and it's hard because I think we do a lot of projection of personality onto our pets, but you can see some pretty objective standard deviations between a pit bull and a Chihuahua and a Doberman and a Saint Bernard, right?
Yeah, and that's also because we've selected different breeds to go in different directions, and so we kind of see more extremes probably, where if you just were to study wolves, you wouldn't see as much breadth in their behavioral repertoire as you are if you like just study domesticated dogs, which they all came from wolves. Just because we're able to really select every behavior to its extreme in any direction we want to go with any individual breed. So we've really just sort of like flattened out like all the behavior in any direction it could possibly go. I would say you'd probably see a lot more variation in like domesticated dogs as a whole than you will in just wolves, for instance. But all those behaviors, at least the roots of them and they exist in wolves. They just needed to be selected for their extremes.
Mm-hmm. And concentrated. Yeah.
So it's fascinating stuff. I'm really happy to talk about all this evolution stuff because I really don't get to talk about it that much anymore. But it's so fascinating, and it's what got me into science in the first place. Yeah. But
when was that? When you were 12 and you were reading Dawkins or something? When was your great?
It was actually maybe when I was around No, I'd always been interested in maybe being a biologist, but I really got super serious about it when I was maybe around 20. I had my real estate license because I dropped out of community college. Well, I flunked out. I got kicked out of community college because I was a business major and I failed all my classes because I didn't care.
Hmm.
And so I got my real estate license and I was doing real estate. I really wish I had my business card here because it's hilarious. Uh, and I was in my spare time, I was reading a lot of Richard Dawkins stuff. I was really into Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Um, and I thought I wanted to be like an astrophysicist maybe because I kind of wanted to go back to school, but I wasn't sure what direction I wanted to go. And it was when I was reading a lot of Stephen Jay Gould, a lot of his natural history essays, and then read Dawkins. I think when I read his book, The Ancestor's Tale, that really just sealed the deal for me.
Hmm.
It's to me that's his masterpiece. It's not his like biggest contribution to evolutionary thought, but it's the best introduction to evolution that anyone could ever have. It's so good. It's like a backwards pilgrimage to the dawn of evolution. So like he has you start now, and then he says, let's go back to your 1000th, great grandmother, your ancestor, 1,000 generations back. Who were they? Okay, let's go back 10,000 generations, 100,000 generations, a million. Who's your 10 millionth ancestor? And then each chapter talks about like what that ancestor did, and it's so good. It's a fascinating book. That sealed the deal for me because I was in those conversations about intelligent design and creationism and stuff too, because I sort of have that scientific debunking, I guess, strain in what I did. I had a blog and everything that did a lot of that and engaged in those debates. And I thought I was doing the same type of thing when I started trying to debunk the weird sex spectrum stuff. But that was a landmine. It was because that was inside the home. That was inside academia where people were making those arguments.
Yeah.
For me to say that that's just as pseudoscientific as what these people were doing. That's what got me in trouble.
Yeah. So you were a nude atheist.
A nude atheist?
Were you part of the new atheism?
Yeah, for sure. Big time. Yeah.
That got corrupted. Well, it got possessed by progressive politics, social justice. I always thought that was interesting how they decried religiosity and then they opened the gates for that. Do you ever ponder that and the direction that atheism went? And
they've gone so insane. It's really bizarre because I was big fans of, do you know Matt Dillahunty by any chance? He's the atheist community of Austin. He was like the leader of that, president for a long time. He's got the Atheist Experience TV show. He was so influential on me. Just how to apply logic, burden of proof, all that stuff. He's a brilliant guy. He really is. And it has been just so amazing to watch him just like his mind just melt with the whole gender stuff. Same thing with like P.Z. Myers. He used to have a blog called Ferangula, evolutionary developmental biologist. I actually think he might have like a mental issue because he's just like completely like a rabid animal when he talks about this stuff. Like he cannot be even reasoned with. And I watched old lectures of him from back in 2010, and he was so reasonable. And now he's unlistenable. He's just so bitter and angry about everything, and it's all the social justice stuff. Matt Dillahunty blocked me on Twitter because I disagreed with him about. I corrected a J.K. Rowling thing he said, and that was it. And that was he was like one of my heroes at the time. And so it's really been bizarre watching the atheist movement just really been taken over by the whole gender stuff, especially because they're all about free thought and debate and rejecting groupthink, or at least they were. And I'm exiled from that whole community too. They're some of the most religious people I know now. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, one day I was scrolling through Reddit and I entered into a comment section. I'm like, how did I get into a fundamentalist? What am I reading? This is so fundamentalist. Everybody's just like so hardcore believing. And then I looked at the subreddit. It was atheism. I'm like, oh, that's weird.
There were some good glory days. I mean, there was a big like a forum, the richarddawkins.net on his website. Like after he released the God Delusion, his website had a forum, and it was like this atheist forum, and you could like ask any question. It wasn't just about atheism. There were several different subtopics, and I was so active on there, and it was this like really amazing like hub of free thought. That ended up getting shut down because he didn't like a lot of the conversations that were happening on there because they would get too risque, I guess. But then it switched over to Reddit because when that shut down, everyone in the atheist community was looking for a forum, and Reddit was kind of there, and so they took over Reddit. It initially had just a bunch of memes, and memes were sort of destroying that Reddit for a while, and then they banned memes, and then the conversation got a little better, and then the gender stuff hit, and then it just went insane. Like it just turned into a cult, basically. That's when I checked out of it. I mean, I'm still like on the advisory thing of the Atheists for Liberty, which is sort of an anti-woke atheist organization, but they're only anti-woke because they think that the wokeness is a religion in and of itself, and so they're just like, they're just being, I see it as being consistent. And so, yeah, I mean, I try to do stuff with them and promote them, but it's really not a conversation that I think is front and center in society right now, given the whole woke stuff going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought about Sam Harris was interviewed last week, and there was a stir. You probably saw this stir. He made some claims about Donald Trump that just seemed very irrational. It seemed like this paragon of rationality was being very irrational. So you picked up that too. I riffed on that, and I know that individuals can be atheist. I know that individuals can be free thinkers and not necessarily need a mythological structure to inform their morality. I understand that on an individual level, but I don't think more than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people. I think the group dynamic is invariably religious in some way. And if you're not conscious of the tribal nature of religion and how religion possibly was an adaptation specifically to organized groups, if you're not aware of that, then it can creep up in various different ways. It will creep up in a different way. So I think on that level, on a group level, religion kind of is inevitable, and that's probably something you might not disagree, or you might disagree with. I don't know how you avoid that, and what happened to atheism or new atheism is kind of just what I'm pointing to when I look at that.
Yeah, I think the atheism going mainstream was, in some ways it was good, but then in some ways it was really bad, because the original like atheist movement before it really blew up was really just a bunch of skeptics, and they were kind of all across the political spectrum. Really, they were just, we're skeptical of these claims, we're debunking UFOs, we're doing this. It was like skepticism was like the central principle that united them. Yeah, they happened to also apply their skepticism to this God question, and they concluded that they didn't think there was justification to believe in it. And that's where I was. But then once it went mainstream with like the God delusion and the Four Horsemen, all that stuff, it attracted a lot of attention from just your everyday person, and most of the people who were attracted to it at the time were people on the left, because there was a lot of attacks on like evolution in schools. Yeah. There was a lot of discussion about, homophobia coming mainly from the religious right. And so it really, there was a lot of like Democrats that just jumped onto the atheist bandwagon because they used it as a way to club, conservative Christians down. But you could see that where the divide was when people would say like, yeah, Christianity's crazy. Yeah, so is Islam. And then they'd be like, wait a minute, what'd you say? Like, you started criticizing Islam. And that was the main difference, where you couldn't say the same things about Islam that you could say about Christianity. And that's because that's where the identity politics came in there with like the whole political ideology. So it became political and less about skepticism. It became Democrats who happened to also not believe in God, rather than centering around skepticism first type of thing. Mm-hmm. That's its popularity was what ended it, really, just because it got too mainstream.
Yeah, Peter Boghossian.
Other forces.
Peter
hold up.
Boghossian a couple years ago said that he'd rather argue with Christians than with the woke, because at least Christians, like, you can actually reason with them. It's interesting because
Yeah.
with the woke, there's things that you can't question. There's things that you can't question. Maybe, I don't know how gender became the thing that you can't question. I kind of understand how oppression is something that you can't question, but for whatever reason, there are these things in this community that was nominally skeptic, carved out things that you can't question. Whereas Christians that were engaged in argument with atheists, I think largely were trying to defend. They were running towards the questioners. They weren't saying, you can't question, you can't question, you can't question, because that would put them out of the conversation if they did that. And they wanted to engage in that conversation. It seems like there's some sort of power dynamic where they have the power to rope off certain things. The behavior of blocking people is basically saying, you can't question this. This is therefore basically a god or an idol or a fetish. This is basically very straight. This is a sacred thing. So it's just interesting to see that the religious imagination will pop up to anybody and anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I would much rather debate Christians and religious people than the woke people. I mean, it's mainly, I think, because Christians, they agree that truth exists. You know, they're truth seekers. They think that there is an objective reality that we're trying to understand. We're maybe coming from it at different angles and have different assumptions that are informing the way we're approaching things. And but ultimately, you know, they're receptive to evidence to a degree. You know, some people will just fall back and say, well, it's just my faith and whatever. And like, okay, at least we're like making the same observations about the state of the world. We might interpret it differently, but you know, we can still see that males and females are there. This mountain exists, all that stuff like that. You know, it's not just like social construction, because you talk to the woke people, and it's that whole everything's the social construct. Truth is socially constructed. It's not out there. It's sort of in
Sex is
our heads.
Colonial construct. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you can't really talk to them in the same way that you can. You know, it's really that modernism versus postmodernism. And I think even though there's like major debates between Christians and atheists, like they're still modern debates. They're still like they still understand evidence, reason, philosophy they're applying. And, you know, there's guardrails to their discussions to a large degree about, you know, what counts as evidence and when to concede and when to not. You know, it's not just flooding the field with
thought terminating cliches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pretty much. It's that Marxist to the angle where it's just like all this stuff is justified because the ends are going to be, you know, what we're trying to achieve here. So I can't. I mean, I will talk with them, not because I think I'm going to convince them of anything, but I think there's a lot of people on the sidelines who could benefit from watching that engagement. But no, it's incredibly frustrating to talk to truly the true believer woke people about anything.
I asked Andrew Doyle a version of this question earlier, and he rebutted me. He put me in my place, but I'm still curious because it's a theistic question. You appear to be either agnostic or atheist. Where does the meaning or transcendent or the metaphysical aspect of life, how do you encounter that, and how do you commune with that, if that's important, or do you just not need that? You're fine with accepting some whiskey in the evening and material reality throughout the rest of the day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it, I don't need or see why there needs to be like this ultimate cause or this ultimate meaning, sort of like on a cosmic scale, that to give my life meaning. I'm more like I'm fine with the proximate meanings that I have that are just around me, like my family. I gain so much meaning from being the son to my mom and my dad, and those relationships. And, when I achieve something, like those are the first people I call. They give, meaning to my life in so many ways. Um, I would eventually like to have my own children, start my own family, and I would gain meaning from them and just trying to instill them with certain values that I think are good and letting them grow into, who they grow into be. I mean, to me, like I just gain so much meaning from my life from my proximate interactions with people around me. Um, I feel like I do. I just don't innately have that desire for like a greater meaning beyond that. Um, yeah, I know that that's maybe not common. I don't know. Um, I know Richard Dawkins used to say something like, they would ask him, what are you going to replace religion with when it's gone? Because he was trying to eliminate it, and he would say something like he would rebut by saying, well, what do you replace the cancerous tumor with when you when you remove it from somebody? It's a snarky comeback. It's
Yeah,
a really
yeah.
good thing, and I used to be just being like, that was sort of how I would respond to that. Um, but I do think there is a role for religion in these meaning making ways for people to sort of organize their lives around. I do accept that it's an important thing for maybe at a societal level for at least enough people maybe to have sort of these meaning making mechanisms in their lives. The question for me is like, do you have to have a belief system that entails believing falsehoods in order for that to be effective? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe at a societal level, you need to have people buy into like certain aspects of things that aren't true. Just
Or
maybe thinking it
unverifiable,
is.
even.
Yeah, aspects of, do you need to believe in Genesis? Do you need to believe in the stories of do you need to believe Jesus was a real person, like, or that he resurrected? Like, do you need to believe in those things, or is there a secular way to do it?
Hmm.
That's a really interesting question to me. If you can take away the things that aren't true and still have it be effective in molding society in ways that are beneficial. I don't think I need it as a personal level, but there's the whole societal level thing,
Hmm.
and I'm more accepting that maybe it's necessary. I don't know. I'm not quite there yet, but that's a question I'd like to explore more with
Hmm.
people who maybe have thought about that to a larger degree. Yeah.
You mentioned Dawkins and Sagan and Gould, who turned you on to what eventually led you to doing this now. All three of those gentlemen are quite good at poetry or the literary aspect of this. Do you see yourself heading in that direction? Do you want to add a little bit of personality and flavor? Do you see that that's an important part of the work, or is it pretty? You want to keep it more on the academic side when it comes to writing?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's true. They do have a really strong poetic streak through them. Dawkins is a really big fan of poetry. I suspect Gould probably is too, and Sagan, I know he quotes a lot of poetry in his books like Cosmos and stuff like that. I have to say, I've never liked poetry, except for like the ones that are like kind of clever
Yeah,
and they rhyme,
yeah.
um, or they'll make me laugh or something like that. But so much poetry I read, I don't know how I'm supposed to read it. It's like, why did you hit enter there? Does that just the way it's constructed? I don't know the tempo I'm supposed to read things. There very rarely will a poem like strike me as being really hitting at like a really fundamental chord that resonates with me. Maybe I just haven't read the right poets or something, but I've read stuff that people have sent me, and I just can't do it. I do like to sort of write more. I mean, people say that my first article, like the New Evolution in Ours, was sort of had some poetic aspects to it in the way it was structured. I would like to be more to add sort of more, I guess, colorful ways of explaining things in the way I write. I do think I write a little dry, which people might be good, might be. bad. I try to be really precise because I think that's just what this debate kind of needs right
Yeah.
now is precision.
Hmm.
But I would like to expand and do some more like natural history essays where I'm kind of being more poetic in my analogies and things like that. That's something I'd really like to do. Because some of my favorite authors are like that. Like, have you ever read Lauren Isley before, by any chance? He
I
wrote
don't
like
think so.
the Night Country. He wrote The Immense Journey. He's just it makes me angry how good of a writer he is when I read his stuff. And he's an anthropologist. He writes about evolution. And it's just breathtaking. I just can't imagine writing like that guy. But he's amazing. And I would love to sort of incorporate some of those tools that he's using to unlock parts of your brain that you don't get from like a scientific paper or
Yeah.
from just like a really analytical, precise paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that. That's something I can see myself doing.
Yeah, yeah. I started very slowly writing my thoughts on gender because I've been thinking and investigating it so much, and I took very extreme poetic aphoristic tact, and because one of my contentions is that gender is an aspect of culture that is incredibly potent and incredibly beautiful, and the crucible by which children are born eventually. Gender is what attracts a man to a woman and a woman to a man, and there's a magic in that. And yeah, it goes over the edge in certain cases when it's enforced on people, but there's such an emergent field of fun there that I don't think we can respectfully treat the topic of gender without giving a wink and a nod to flirtation and wit and what turns people on, right?
That's what gets you in trouble on Twitter.
Yeah, it does. But that's where I venture. That's where I venture. But
I agree. It's you need to have fun with sort of the whole gendered presentation. That's part of what's so wrong is everything's gotten so serious, I think, about this topic.
even when
And
it's
it never had
extreme
to be like
spectacle, even when it's extreme spectacle, it's very serious. Like the drag queen story hour, it's just there's
Yeah.
something kind of overwrought
It's artificial.
about the artificial. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. It's the artificiality that really just turns me off about that stuff. It's like there's an agenda behind it. It's not like it's just a emerging from someone's inner self as a true expression of what they are. It's highly manicured and thought and beforehand, and you're trying to shock people or something. I don't know. It's not like a natural expression of human diversity, I guess, in a way. It's like a production.
Speaking of diversity, what's two or three of your famous favorite whiskeys at this point? And did you start distilling your own yet? Are you on that? Have you ventured there yet? Or is
I
that
cannot
under
comment
wraps?
on that, given
Okay.
certain federal. I would like to, maybe.
Okay, yeah, this is crossing state lines right now, so we don't get into your moonshine business, but
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, whiskey's my number one go-to.
yeah.
Oh, it's such a broad category. I tend to favor the scotches over the bourbons, although I've been really exploring a lot of these Tennessee whiskeys since I've been living in Tennessee.
Is
And
there
I found
something particular about the Tennessee whiskey that's
there's a really big debate in the whiskey community about if Tennessee whiskey's actually bourbon or if it's not. So to be Tennessee whiskey, it's basically everything that a bourbon is, but they have to do this certain charcoal filtering process that it's got a certain name to it. I actually can't remember the name of it. But other places they're outside of Tennessee, they do the same thing, but they can't call themselves Tennessee whiskey because they're not in Tennessee. And there's nothing about Tennessee whiskey that makes it not bourbon, even though Jack Daniels will tell you like this isn't bourbon. Like it's bourbon. It's just Tennessee whiskey is a subset of bourbon. It's not a big deal. It's just the way it is. But I've been getting into a really good Tennessee rye whiskey that's a barrel proof, single barrel select that's been excellent. So that's been one of my favorites lately. But in general, My favorites are a lot of these older scotches. Um, a lot of the stuff that's like in sherry casks or the Speyside scotches. Those are
Does
really good.
the Scotch actually have to be produced in Scotland to be Scotch, or
Yeah,
okay?
yeah. There's like places that'll do like Scotch style whiskeys in the States by using like barley instead of corn and stuff like that. But yeah, to be Scotch, you have to be in Scotland. Taiwan is making amazing whiskey. One of my favorite is this barrel proof Taiwanese whiskey called Kavalan that was aged in ex-bourbon barrels. It's amazing. Something about the Taiwanese climate just like ages things rapidly, where it tastes like a 20-year-old bottle, but it's actually only 4 years. It's amazing. They actually beat out like the Scots in like a world whiskey tasting championships several years in a row. So yeah, they're killing it.
It's all those semiconductors they got out
yeah,
there. Just
yeah. No, I love everything about whiskey. I think in the future I would really love to have like my own small craft distillery or something because it's just such a fun thing to do and research.
well,
Yeah.
any two recommendations? Where to venture? Do you want to plug a couple? No.
Trying to think of stuff that people would really enjoy. Um, so yeah, so the Japanese whiskey by Nika, it's called the Japanese. It's called their coffee malt, Coffey. It's not actually related to like coffee beans or anything. It's a type of still they use called a coffee still. It's excellent. It's very sweet and almost like a dessert whiskey. I would recommend that. And then I would probably recommend, for like a really good bourbon that's not expensive would be like the Old Granddad Bottled and Bond. That is cheap and is just everything you want in a bourbon.
I really like Bullet. Bullet is our Bullier.
Bullet is excellent, yeah.
Yeah,
I like the
that's-
Bullet 10-year. They have a really great one. Their rye is pretty good.
Yeah.
Good for mixing and stuff. Yeah.
I enjoy their rye a lot, and plus you can get it in like 75,000
Yeah,
milligram.
giant ones.
Yes, you
Yeah,
can do
that's
it.
solid. Bullet rye was what got me into rye whiskeys.
Oh,
Yeah. Good stuff.
go imagine that, a thing like that. Well, Colin, it's been a long day for me. I'm sure it's a long day for you. You're going to be on Tucker eventually.
I was supposed to be on. I was sitting in the chair. I was all mic'd up, had the thing in my ear and all the makeup, and I was ready to go. And then a little voice came on saying that they had to cancel because Tucker ranted too long in a previous segment. And they were going to have me on the next day. And then Biden forgave $10,000 of student loan for everyone, and so that became the biggest news thing in the world. So they imagined my cartoon wasn't pressing news at that point. So they said they were going to have me on next week, but I don't know. Who knows?
They didn't fly you out to New York, though, right? You have to fly to New
No,
York.
there's a little studio in Nashville that they take me in. So I don't know if I'm actually going to be on Tucker anymore, but they at least said that they'll contact me next week. But who knows if they will?
Well,
I hope so.
Keep on memeing. You'll hit gold again.
Let's keep making some cartoons.
Well, I hope you get back to Twitter soon, but if not, I will link your Substack and the Substack-related Twitter account. And is there anything else you doing a podcast yet, or do you have a YouTube channel going on yet?
Not yet. I'm still trying to get my book out because I think that needs to be priority because things are getting crazy out there.
When is that expected or due?
There's not. I don't have an expected date yet. It's still in the process, but it's where I'm going to be putting the vast majority of my time moving forward. So hopefully soon.
Righty tighty. Well, I can't wait to read it. Can't wait to get you back on again to talk about it.
Yeah,
Maybe
always a
have you
pleasure
on
chatting with you, man.
Another too. Same, Colin. Same. I'll end it.